As you all know and live, social emotional learning and social emotional wellness are key parts and key to the success of our students. And it's also an important area of focus for our success plan this year. To dive into the work with us, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Guerra. Dr. Guerra is a clinical psychologist and executive coach with more than 25 years of experience. He is also co-author of the book, From Stressed to Centered, A Practical Guide to a Happier and Healthier You. He has traveled the USA and abroad, giving talks on a wide range of topics from stress management, evidence-based relaxation strategies, and the importance of the body, mind, brain learning in healing from trauma. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Guerra help us kick off this important conversation. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much, Stacy, for that warm introduction. I'd also like to thank Drs. Adelberg and Escobar and all those who reached out to me to be with you here today to talk about this topic. I'm absolutely honored to be here with all of you. I'd like to open with a short story, a little case study, if you will. Years ago, in 1979 or so, there was a boy on Long Island, said to be about 9 or 10 years old. He was an only child, considered to be fairly bright, and showed some interest in people. He had, in his relatively short life at that moment, already experienced several challenges. A father who had left the home, a mother who was often debilitated by anxiety and would go on to struggle with anxiety throughout her life, even up to death. There was a new man in the house, you could say, like a stepfather, although he and the boy's mother never married, which came with its own level of chaos, as you can imagine. Having to move residences and leave trusted family and friends in one place and negotiate the nuances of new relationships and new trusting connections in a new area. Not to mention visiting weekend step-siblings who would turn the world upside down a bit, and his room, and make it known that their father owned the house. So these early life challenges soon created an inner world for this boy of isolation, low self-confidence, and chronic worry. Worry about his mom, but also about his own future. Now, this boy's 5th grade teacher at the time, a woman named Mrs. Morrison, was someone with a reputation for being stern but caring, kind of by the rules, but showed some flexibility, and also very diligent and creative. Now, she provided all the requisite learning opportunities that one would expect for a 5th grade class, the history lessons, the long division in mathematics, reading, writing, geography, and the like. All the necessary items to progress intellectually, cognitively, and this boy did. But the classroom environment that Mrs. Morrison created, beyond academics, that was the thing that stood out in this boy's memory to this day, and may be argued to have had, out of all, the most lasting and significant impact on his life. Best be described, this environment, as a place to be seen and have the inner experiences and emotions recognized and expressed. Now, this happened in a variety of ways, including play and the use of movement and bodies in play, some art, some journaling, small group exercises, sometimes mirroring, and games of reciprocity, even music and lip sync. And Mrs. Morrison gave individualized feedback that was both meaningful and very, very personal. Not only that, but she asked students to give her feedback about her own performance, and she would write it down, take it very seriously. Those were her gifts, giving and receiving. So back to this boy and the situation he was living in. In that class, there was a little bit of time each day to leave school, having been validated, been heard, to have spent time in an environment where that isolated inner world could somehow be touched. Not directly, maybe, but significantly. To have that world be safely addressed, to have feelings and sense of self even integrated, or simply acknowledged. That left a lasting impression. Well, it may or may not be apparent at this time that that boy was me, depending on how I came off, and that this time in my life where pain was met with connection was very important. Not planned for me specifically, and maybe not intentional, but impactful. It would be a gross understatement to say that teachers and educators do not have an impact on students' lives, or have an impact on students' lives, an understatement. But why am I sharing such a personal and somewhat uneasy story like this right out of the gate here in an opening of a keynote address? Well, it's certainly not to have the violin start playing for me somewhere on the side, or to sort of squeeze out all the sympathy I can get from this audience. I realize there are a lot of stories out there, much worse, and not to minimize what happened in my life, but there are a lot of stories out there, and I'm sure if I interviewed everybody, I would hear them. But there are particular reasons I bring this up, and it really starts with bringing this story back to you. The first is that part of redeveloping a world and school community that focuses on staying connected in an uncertain world and addressing social emotional learning and character education involves vulnerability. And how vulnerable is that right out of the gate, right? So we're just getting to know one another, and here we are. Okay, one of my favorite people and researchers on the lecture circuit, also an author, Brené Brown, in her book Daring Greatly, points to vulnerability as the most accurate measure of courage. She also describes it as a birthplace of love, belonging, joy, empathy, and creativity. How much of those relate to school communities, right? Second reason is I told this personal story to get us thinking about the breadth and depth of what each child who walks through your doorways goes through, right even before getting off the bus. The personal issues, the histories, the problems and challenges, sometimes the abuses and neglects. Could be mental health issues, either in the student themselves or at home. Medical issues, and the weight of carrying that around. Also, not forgetting, of course, the resilience, the support, the working through, and the inner drive that also comes through those doors each day, and which can often mediate those challenges. Third reason I bring this up is to provide one concrete example, of course, close to home for me, that long before we had terms like emotional intelligence, or had the bandwidth to have conversations about social emotional learning in schools, long before those elements and processes were discussed specifically, they were operating in certain classrooms, and they're operating right now in many of yours. I can tell that just from being here with you. And they make a difference in providing a full, whole child approach to education. Last, and most importantly, I'm opening this story to emphasize and underline how much each and every one of you matter to the development, the character, and the inner world of each child that you come in contact with in this school district and beyond. And that includes everyone from administration, support staff, teachers, principals, coordinators, superintendents, and of course, parents. And I'm sure I'm leaving some folks out, so please forgive me. I think it's more than apt at this juncture to acknowledge you and to thank you for your incredible work that you're doing each and every day. Would it be too much to have one more round of applause for yourself at this juncture just to kick this off? Thank you. So how can we stay connected in this uncertain world that we're living in and continue to develop emotionally healthy school communities. We'll begin to tackle this by first shifting our focus from only information-driven or cognitive solutions to awareness, emotional intelligence, and listening-driven solutions. To understand and talk a bit about stress and the nervous system as a way to begin understanding that, and introduce the role of trauma in students, but also on all of you as educators, and hopefully have some time at the end to address how we can ameliorate the impact of this. I'll introduce a practice that we can try right here and to begin to address it. I think there are very simple evidence-based learnings and practices that are great additions to teaching the whole child and getting at the root of the problems we see in school and ones that continue into adulthood. But just a brief word of warning here, because I know you're a very diligent and hardworking group who may quite rightly be looking for answers or curriculum. And I want to invite you all to just unhook right now from any pressure to figure it all out by the end of the day. And instead, let's agree to look at this as a launching point for further discussion. In fact, one which we can also begin to start to have in the debrief section. And let's trust the process of doing a deeper dive in due time as we get our arms a bit around this and what we're faced with as the larger school community. So where are the difficulties? Here's what I've seen in my discussions in practice as part of the disconnection and talking to folks much like you. Certainly a moderate amount of stress can be very good for achievement, but most of us are finding ourselves in the higher ranges of stress going unmanaged, which can lead to distress. Of course, higher expectations being placed not only on students, but naturally on teachers too, and meeting these expectations in increasingly shorter periods of time. We know about drug use and self-medicating. Bullying, of course, is taking on newer and quicker, more pervasive kinds of outlets with the onslaught of social media. And I've highlighted here the lack of resilience. Many reports of students showing increasing difficulty with bouncing back in the face of challenge or stress, what we might refer to as resilience, although we see resilience still present as evidenced by so much that has transpired in the world in the wake of school violence, for an example, and we still persist. I want to skip down to the Atlas syndrome, something I and others have referred to as having the weight of the world on your shoulders in a society that expects answers of our young people to the world's problems, and maybe even feeling like you have to stay strong in the face of all of that as well. Isolation, which we mentioned, mental health issues, suicidality, which is on the rise in young people, and I happen to know has touched this community very deeply. And of course, with mental health issues come sometimes psychiatric hospitalizations and all that that contributes to, and school violence. We're living in a time where that is very relevant. So who or what is to blame here? I think the first culprit in disconnection is stress, and just breaking that down a little bit about what we mean, rather than just using it as an all-encompassing word. So if you break this up into these four categories, we can start to think how stress begins to impact us and what happens in our nervous system and what you may be seeing from day to day. I could go on and on about all the indicators in these areas, but physical ones, rapid heart rate, difficulty with weight loss or gain, backaches, digestive issues, increasing colds, lowered immune system. Emotional indicators of stress like apathy, feeling of being on edge, irritable mood, feelings of unworthiness. Cognitive or thinking indicators, trouble concentrating, forgetfulness, negative thinking, poor judgment, and of course the behavioral indicators, sleeping more than usual, making poor decisions, use of alcohol and drugs, nervous habits, isolating yourself from others. I'm sure these are on our radar already. Well, Time magazine put out a neat article in October, just sort of getting us on board about what young people are dealing with. If you look at a couple of these, is 75% of school-aged children reporting a lot of stress around awareness of school shootings. Nearly 3/4 also said they could have used more emotional support over the year, students. And this Generation Z, in this range of 15 to 21, reporting just the worst mental health of any generation, according to the APA's Stress in America survey. Some other stats about student stress here. And by the way, I've prepared a group of these slides that I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested, and I'll send that along, so don't feel like you have to. You can take notes, but you don't have to remember all of these. More than 1/3 of teens reporting fatigue or feeling tired, 36%, and nearly 1/4 of teens report skipping a meal, all due to stress. Many teens feeling overwhelmed, depressed, or sad as a result of stress. And the teen stress experience is so similar to that of adults. Even more concerning is that they seem to underestimate the impact that stress is having on their physical and mental health. So in children, stress can manifest in some similar ways as teens and adults, but it has its own sort of process as well. Sometimes decreased appetite, headache, new or recurrent bedwetting, nightmares, sleep disturbances, that upset stomach report or that vague kind of pain, and other physical symptoms with no apparent physical illness. Just a little look on the stats and stress. Number 2 reason that I think might be a culprit, we'll get to in a second, and that relates to trauma. And before we move to that, just wanted to make us aware of the sources of stress. Maybe fairly apparent, but I think sometimes we get lost in this. So there's the stress that comes from the outside. Things like deadlines and weather and traffic and a spouse or partner who might have some complaints about us. Everyone's nodding and relating. Don't look at your partners if they're here by chance. Okay, good. So those things come from the outside. Then there are internal sources of stress, and this is really where we are today, where I want to talk about, because with internal sources of stress, we have a greater sense of control. Things like how we think. Issues like the kind of language that I'm using, my tone, how I'm receiving others, how I'm interacting with others. These are in our control, and with a little practice and a little nuancing can have a very big impact on our own systems and the nervous systems of others. Okay, we've arrived at trauma. Another word that now is being tossed around quite a bit, but worth thinking about a bit more deeply. Trauma is on the rise, partly because of the increase in stressful events out there that we're exposed to and how we respond to it internally. But also we see an increase because of our nuanced understanding of trauma and how it operates in the individual and in our brains. It used to be that we didn't use the word trauma unless we were talking about very severe, externally identifiable acts like war or rape or watching somebody get murdered, all terrible things. But a more sophisticated understanding of trauma helps us see it doesn't really take too much exposure to prolonged stress or adverse experiences or neglect to cause significant shifts in the brain that look like trauma. The same kinds of symptoms and outcomes that people who have seen war or have gone through horrors of sexual assault, that they exhibit. Similar. We have to begin to understand that trauma has a significant impact on the brain and brain structures that are responsible for things like language, our sense of safety, and our ability to self-regulate our emotions and psychological responses, all of which will have an impact on our ability to learn new information. A complex trauma describes both children's exposure to multiple traumatic events, often an invasive interpersonal nature, and it refers to the wide-ranging long-term effects of that exposure. These events are severe and pervasive, like abuse or profound neglect. Extreme trauma brings us back to what we typically regard as trauma in the past. And developmental trauma describes childhood trauma, such as chronic abuse, neglect, or other harsh adversity in their own homes. Why are we seeing so much trauma? I'm sure all of you have your own observations and thoughts about this. All of these factors from the slide is why we're seeing so much trauma, I believe, what I'm gathering from my research and talking to folks in my clinical practice. The general overarching point is that we're living in a world where our nervous systems are being taxed in a very persistent way and translated through internal filters that say we should be doing more in a shorter amount of time. Not only that, but our ways of coping and dealing with that have moved toward isolation and disconnection. There used to be a time when we connected like this. Now we're connecting like this. And I'm not somebody who hates technology. I think it's awesome. But there's something happening. And this is having a negative impact on our brains. It's affecting our social engagement and our personal relationships, in part. There are other reasons. Let's take a look at just some trauma stats here. So this is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And you can see the increase over the years. 3/4 of victims in this research were neglected, 18.2% physically abused, and 8.5% sexually abused. If we can just think about that opening story and what might be coming in those doors. So this study, if you don't know about it, was a real hallmark and is really leading us in eventually to solutions. The Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE studies. For those of you not familiar, it was a collaboration between the Centers of Disease Control and a man named Vincent Folletti, who was an internist and chief of Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventive Medicine in San Diego in 1985. And also Robert Anda, another MD and co-investigator. More than 50,000 Kaiser patients participated in this comprehensive evaluation, addressing carefully defined categories of adverse childhood experiences. These included abuses and neglect, but also included family dysfunction, having parents who were divorced, mentally ill or addicted or in prison. And a subgroup of this group provided information about childhood events, and their responses were compared to the medical records that Kaiser had kept on all of their patients. So these abuses defined any of the following abuses to a child under the age of 18 by a parent, caregiver, or another person in a custodial role, such as clergy or a coach or a trainer, that will result in harm, potential for harm, or threat of harm. Physical abuse, the intentional use of physical force that can result in hitting, kicking, shaking, burning. Sexual abuse involving pressuring or forcing a child to engage in sexual acts. Emotional abuse refers to behaviors that harm a child's self-worth of emotional well-being. Examples like name-calling, shaming, rejection, withholding love, and threatening. And then neglect is a failure to meet a child's basic physical and emotional needs, including housing, food, clothing, education, and access to medical care. Here's what the studies have shown, just in distilling that. And I'd be interested now to see an ACE study to see how many children are adversely impacted by information overload, the ability and availability of access and content of reporting domestic and overseas terrorism, and that catastrophic nature of those reports. We'll see if one like that happens. I wanted to show you this pyramid of the ACE studies. And what I'd like to focus on here, very relevant to what we're discussing, is the middle. Let's see here if my pointer works. Oh, look at that. Right here and here. Disrupted neurodevelopment and social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. What we're seeing here as from birth to death, with the generation of trauma being passed down and maybe not addressed, we get that passed on, impacting social conditions, then adverse childhood experiences and a disruption in neurodevelopment. And unfortunately, also early death, which connects us to suicide and also physical and emotional illnesses that impact lifespan. So we know that this happens. But why? What's happening in here? I'd like to talk a little bit about emotional dysregulation. It's a term used in the mental health community that refers to emotional responses that are poorly modulated and do not lie within the accepted range of emotive response. Possible examples of emotional dysregulation include angry outbursts, behavioral outbursts such as destroying or throwing objects, aggression towards self or others, threats of suicide, and these variations usually occur in seconds to minutes or hours. Emotional dysregulation can lead to behavior problems and interfere with a person's social interactions and relationships at home, at school, or employment. Why should we regulate? Well, our nervous system, including our stress responses, our physiological arousal at any given moment, and our response to threat, flight, fight, and freeze, that nervous system is giving feedback to us and developing sensitivities to how we respond in the world to external stimuli and relationships. This also becomes a loop in the way that we regulate our emotions or not, and how we behave also begins to feed back information to the nervous system and brain and gives us a signal as to whether or not we're safe. And then we see the resulting neurochemicals, bodily responses, and sensations that occur and are commensurate with that feedback. We're looking for opportunities for connection and attunement. So what helps? Well, the first thing is right under our nose, literally, and something that is often said. It comes with that ancient wisdom, right? Just take a breath. Hold your breath and count to 10. All of these are in our language. But I don't think that we really tapped into the power of how we can harness that and what happens in our physiologies when we learn how to control the breath. See, it all really starts, I'm learning, and I believe, with our physiology. We can get to emotions and the psyche and behaviors, but if you're coming in with a traumatized nervous system, what can we do to have an impact? So breath, you'll be experiencing that today. Mindfulness, which in my 20 years of study is really the harnessing of a non-judgmental awareness. It's not stopping thoughts. It's not being calm. It's really just that. Helping others regulate through language or tone, and validation of emotions. Not fixing, not sympathy, just validation, and leading with compassion. When in doubt, throw up a baby photo. So we're all trying to establish that safety that I hope many babies and infants have experienced with their parents. Their nervous system is primed and ready, and their brains are only developing. You'll see a brain slide in a moment that shows us our very higher order functionings in the prefrontal cortex. And I think as adults, it may be a little bit And maybe as educators, without stepping on toes, or psychologists, it may be where we get stuck in that higher order thinking and forget that we still have that primal brain, that limbic system. How do we keep them connected? Because that early brain doesn't go away. Well, if we've had some great experiences, I hope everybody has experienced on either side the game of peekaboo. And you've heard me talk about reciprocity. And by the way, I have to acknowledge Stacy here. She engaged you all in an exercise of reciprocity. I don't know the first word, but I know it was agor, amen? Ago, amen. And she connected and attuned the crowd right off the bat. And that's when I knew I was in the right place for this kind of thing. So reciprocity and social engagement starts very early. And we can maybe already start to think where it might be disrupted. Let's take a look at the brain here. What distinguishes humans from most other mammals is that we can think about our own thinking and this idea of being self-reflective. The goal is to get back online to connect this area, the prefrontal cortex, where we have executive functioning, to our more primal brain, that limbic system, where, believe it or not, even though many of us hold ourselves as super rational and logical, studies have shown, hate to break it to all of us, that many of our decisions are made in split seconds related to emotions. Here is where we have an opportunity to reconnect with training and identifying where the problems are. Now, these next few slides might feel kind of like a jarring shift, but I wanted to at least make sure we spent a few moments on them because I know suicide has touched this community and that it is an issue with respect to untreated traumatic events, nervous systems, mental health issues, and sometimes chronic stress. So suicide is a leading cause in the top 10 of death causes and second leading cause for young people in the 10 to 34-year-old range. Again, you'll get these stats from me. Just another way to look at it, age-adjusted suicide rates, trends over time. The rate is based on the number of people who have died by suicide with 100,000 population. And because change in population size are taken into effect, these rates allow for comparisons from one year to the next. Figure 1 showing the age-adjusted rates in the United States from 2001 to 2017 for males and females presented separately. And during that 16-year period, total suicide rate increased 31%. And the suicide rate among males remains nearly about 4 times higher than among females. Figure 2 here shows the crude rates of suicide within gender and age categories in 2017. Among females, suicide rate highest for those between 45 and 54, and among males, age 65 and older. So, obviously, suicide impacts not only the person and their families, but the community at large. And I happen to feel optimistic about the issues that we're talking about now, maybe not solving all of the world's mental health problems, but perhaps shifting a person into a range of ability to control the nervous system and the physiology that perhaps such an extreme behavior can be avoided. Okay, back to the path towards solutions. And here is where we begin to move into the how. That is, how do we begin to address what we're seeing in our students and maybe among ourselves? So I had the honor and the privilege to study with this person, Dr. Vanderkolk, for a week-long training on how trauma really works in the body and the brain and what modalities of healing we should be focused on to address it. So Dr. Vanderkolk is out of Harvard and has spent really his whole 50-year career as a psychiatrist and researcher studying this kind of thing. And the book, if you don't know it, is a culmination of a lot of his work. It's very readable. I really recommend it. The basic tenet here is that for folks who have experienced trauma, and as we can see from previous slides, it's on the increase, happening many ways now. For those folks, our ability to learn, communicate, develop relationships, and thrive is completely impaired. And he gave all of us therapists a reprimand in the training that said, talking is not enough. Something else has to happen. And we need to address that emotional stuckness in the body and through the body. And these are some of the therapies that he's finding useful, of which I've also had really the privilege and honor to train in and to teach and be involved in for myself, and can talk to any of you more personally about those things after the keynote or any time. I'm completely interested in these topics. So this is the link here right now to what we might be able to start doing in some measure in schools. It doesn't take much to have a positive impact, but we need to take that body and brain into account. If you're not familiar with any of these, I could just highlight two. I mean, I know you're familiar with some of those up there, but EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which finds its place mostly in the therapist's office and involving certain tapping and movements and eye movements while speaking about trauma. It's a very useful therapy and has a lot of good outcomes. Improvisation and playback theater is a form of theater that plays back the stories that you hear from the audience. It's usually weaved around a social justice theme or something very important like mental health or racism or prison systems, and the actors listen to the story in real time and just play it back through improvisation. I've had the pleasure of being involved in that as well. Body, mind, brain learning. That's where we are. So shifting from an environment, an atmosphere where solely cognitive approaches are king, to an environment that incorporates body, mind, brain. Now this terminology, including SEL and all of the like, is made up, and it's useful. It helps us to organize our thinking around this stuff. So we mustn't get caught up in the category as much as the spirit of what we're talking about here. To see if we can slowly and methodically, and in a short time, thank you teachers, in a short time, begin to consider the benefit of practicing one or two of these in the body, mind, brain learning. There are so many practices that we can be doing, and this excites me. Okay, another very important player in this whole talk is Stephen Porges. Also had a great opportunity to study with him recently. Contemporaries and friends with Dr. van der Kolk, pointing to our physiology and the nervous system as being the key areas of focus if we want to address things like learning, trauma, language, communication, and relationships, and our social engagement. I love when things come together. We had Stacy opening with some reciprocity. We had Colette talking about a wonderful book that addresses the life of an autistic person. And Dr. Porges did a lot of work with autism and how our facial expressions impact the way we socially engage. Autistic children are at a disadvantage because of that. But can it be trained? Again, we've lost this. And good news I want to share with all of you. Dr. Porges says, crow's feet, do not do anything about it. It's telling you that you have a very highly adaptable social engagement system. And even things, I hate to break it to you, like Botox, are actually impacting relationships because people are misreading cues. And not only that, I canceled all my appointments. Not only that, they're misreading the person interacting with the person with the smooth upper face. Misreads cues, but also the person that's on the receiving end of those cues also starts to interact differently. So isn't it incredible that we're coming back to physiology? And I'm going to try not to nerd out completely with you on neuroscience. I love this stuff, but I want to tell you about his theory. It's called polyvagal theory. Maybe some of you know it. Introduced by Stephen Porges in 1994, who was the director of the Body Brain Center at the University of Illinois, basically saying that the vagus nerve, or the 10th cranial nerve, is involved and largely responsible for parasympathetic control of the heart and the lungs and the digestive tract. Parasympathetic nervous system, think rest and digest part of the nervous system, that calming experience. We don't spend much time there anymore. So this means our autonomic nervous system, the stress response, is interconnected with influences that flow from our bodies to our brains. And we have physical reactions that impact heart and stomach. And these are associated with our facial expressions and vagus nerve activity. Our ability to engage socially and to suss out whether or not we're safe really occurs through movements and expressions in the face. You can observe this in the animal world. How many have dog owners? When you take your dog to the next dog park, watch the play. One dog may come up, bite the heel of your dog, or vice versa. The other dog will immediately turn and look at the biting dog and say, "Are we fighting or are we playing?" "Oh, we're playing. Now I bite you." And that's how it goes. Same in humans. We're watching. It's microseconds. So the branches of the vagal nerve serve different stress responses in mammals. The more primitive branch elicits immobilization behaviors, like feigning death. You can see this in the animal world too, with mice and cats often. Whereas the more evolved branch is linked to social communication and self-soothing behaviors. The more primitive systems are activated only when the more evolved functions fail. Think trauma. And why, unfortunately, in our courtrooms, often women will be grilled as to why they didn't do anything. This is a response to threat and a survival to freeze. Adaptive in the moment when you're being attacked or your life is in danger. Not so adaptive when the threat has been removed. So our physiological state, Dr. Porges says, dictates a range of behaviors and our psychological experience, which then has implications for the study of stress, emotions, and social behavior. The social emotional learning that we're addressing today, and what I think we'll all in this room are really after, begins with making sure we have that social engagement system functioning very well, to bring this back into attunement, because it's been disrupted or compromised by the things we're talking about. Trauma's effect on the nervous system will either have perpetual fight or flight, have to keep moving. I'm sure you see this in your classrooms. It's not the only reason that happens for trauma, but if there is trauma, you may see that. Have to keep moving. It's happening in the body. Van der Kolk showed us a picture after 9/11, people running in the streets after that terrible tragedy. A bunch of therapists in the room, and he says, "What do you see in this picture?" And everybody said, "Terror, anxiety, thinking about loved ones." And he said, "No, they're running." Right? Getting us to think again that the body has to express when something traumatic happens. The other version that happens is perpetual shutdown. And for some people, ongoing trauma can create just that feeling of being trapped in your own body, unable to move, described as a living hell. One example, just another slide to look at what we're talking about with this vagus nerve. I love this slide. I think the creators did a wonderful job. Just showing you how, as arousal increases, we move from social engagement, being present, grounded, curious, to fight or flight, vacillating back and forth between having to run away or maybe confront and fight the threat. And then if it's prolonged, a freezing, a sense of helplessness, depression, and all of what's happening with the vagus nerve on the right-hand side. Okay, in interest of time, we'll move on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of empathy. Another one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, but I like to unpack things and see what it is that we're really talking about. Certainly empathy can be putting yourself in others' shoes, and that's important, but it's also important to emphasize what empathy is not, and that is sympathy. Because some of us get turned off with those fluffy emotional terms. Understandably, it can go too far in the other direction. And we may think that we don't have time to waste focusing on people's feelings, getting all touchy and feely about this sort of thing, but that sort of process is not helpful at all. So let's talk about what is. Empathy is a solid, neuroscientifically studied pillar of emotional intelligence, and it speaks directly and precisely to all the things we've discussed so far. It can be taught. It is lacking for various reasons, including disengagement socially, and without it, healthy relationships and good leadership cannot occur. If we look a little deeper into it, we find that empathy just isn't empathy. There are three kinds of types, I'm sure maybe even more. Cognitive empathy is that natural curiosity about another person's reality. We call that mind-to-mind understanding. Emotional empathy, feeling what the other person feels. It's a body-to-body sense and requires a different attention muscles, facial, vocal tone, and other nonverbal signals. And it also requires us to tune into ourselves. Empathic concern is the expression of care for another, most similar to what happens in the brain with parental love. We call that a heart-to-heart connection. Which is most important? Well, all three in various capacities. Let me just wait here for this to load. I have a short video to show you on this by Brene Brown.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I feel my own emotions well up when I watch that video each time for some reason. I think there's something to it. Okay. Time is ticking, so I want to just briefly show you that the Japanese symbol for listening is much more complex than what we're used to. It involves feeling and focusing and thinking and hearing and seeing. I think that's an area, listening, where we can also train and work differently with our students and ourselves. Do a lot of training in listening and the different levels of listening. Won't have time to review them here, but I want to move right to the slide here, which probably is my most important slide. And that is that I truly believe that any of this that we're speaking about requires a real shift from thinking that this is something to be learned and imparted to others, which works well in other categories perhaps, academics and cognition, as much as it is to embody this ourselves and learn it from the inside out. It's a sharing and a way of being more than a list to add to your curriculum. And that's tricky because there still has to be a doing. So let's do a doing. I'd like to run a practice with you at the moment. We'll go right into it. And I'd like everybody just to uncross their legs if that's comfortable and okay, and just put everything, all items to the side. I'm going to grab something real quick. Okay, so if I can have your attention. Just sense your body sitting in the chair and bring your awareness to the fact that you have a body. That's a first part of awareness. And if you'd like, you can allow your eyes to close or you can leave them open, whatever's comfortable. So I'd like you to just tune into how your body feels at the moment, internally, without judgment. You can notice how you feel on the level of tension or stress. You can notice how you feel on the level of activity of mind or any feelings that are coming up. Just take notice. Don't try to fix it or change it. Just being aware, non-judgmental. Register that. And now, I'd like everybody to start thinking about what has to be done when this talk ends. Spend a moment thinking about all of the things on your list, how much time pressure there is, and what this week ahead and the next will bring. And notice any changes in your physiology. Perhaps you felt a jump in your heart rate, but perhaps not. We all have different bodies, different brains. Just notice. Okay. Take note, register that. And now I'd like to introduce an exercise to you. So become aware with eyes closed if comfortable. If not, you can just gaze softly at a spot. Become aware of the fact that you're breathing. Again, not changing the breath or manipulating it. Just notice. I'd like you all to begin breathing in the following way. I'd like you to inhale to a count of 3. And I'd like you to exhale to a count of 6. Inhaling to 3 and exhaling to 6. If you're worried about the count, don't be. Just allow it to flow and don't get caught up in how fast or slow the count needs to be. You can adjust how quickly or slowly you count to accommodate this practice. Stay with it, inhaling to 3 and exhaling to 6. For those of you that want to extend, exhale to 7. And notice that you can exhale the breath much more than you originally thought. Continue with this practice for a few moments, and I'll end it with the sound of a chime. Okay, good. Take note of any changes in the body or in the mind. What we did there is the power behind the pause. And pausing is something we can all implement fairly easily. I'm going to move us on to a small debrief here. And so for the next 2 or 3 minutes, just as a way to try to bring all this consolidated information back home to you, I'd like you to turn to a neighbor or two and just discuss 1 or 2 of the following questions. Just real easy, whatever comes to the top of the mind, and then I'll ring those chimes again to bring you back, and we'll close out this talk. Try not to go too far, just 2 or 3 minutes. Oh, okay. Coming back. Coming back, please. Okay, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I regret having to make that so short. There was a lot of energy and activity in the room, and I really encourage you to continue the conversation. Drawing things to a close, I did want to just review quickly. So this is the how. These are some of the things you can think about if you want to take this further. And I'm happy to talk to any one of you about how this can happen in a deeper way. And here's the process here. These are also some useful resources, apps, YouTube, starting small and very achievable, connecting with me. And this is the possible work that we can do together, or there are a lot of great practitioners out there. This is what I've been doing with folks. And again, you'll have these slides to take a look at a little bit more. But I do have a challenge for you before we end, and is that with all the time and the time pressures and the amount of work that I know each and every one of you have, could there be time for a 3 to 5 minute experiment of picking one piece of this that you know and implementing it on a regular basis? Doesn't have to be daily, regular can be weekly, or whatever you can find time to, and to actually measure what you're seeing in the way of learning, in the way of behavior, in the way of attention and focus. It certainly is a low-hanging fruit in terms of risk-reward, and I'd be very interested to see what happens. I don't know how many of you know what BHAG is, but in the corporate world we refer to as big, hairy, audacious goals. And my big, hairy, audacious goal for you, and it's really a question, is that might it be, relating to school violence, might it be the case that somewhere out there might be a kid who's disconnected, who's unvalidated, who's not addressing social needs because of trauma, because of difficulties in the home, and with a little bit of connection or validation or practice or mirroring, might we actually be able to have an impact on future violence? Maybe I'm an optimist or an idealist, but I wonder, I think about that, and I leave that question with you. 2 quotes, which I think, bringing it back to you, intertwining social and emotional learning and academics advances the ability of our students to adapt to change with the essential skills to effectively manage new challenges. That's by Dr. Karen Burke. And last but not least, teachers affect eternity. I believe it. No one can tell where their influence stops. Shameless plug. And that's my contact information. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Guerra. You've given us a lot to think about, and you've taught us a lot today. I just wanted to share that what's resonating, especially for me right now, is the importance for every one of us to take the deep breath, to employ empathy, and to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and taking care of one another so that we can be present and care for our students and create those safe spaces that they need to learn and grow along with us. I would also like to thank Dr. Guerra for the revelation that my crow's feet are socially engaging. So thank you.